So our forums that we've held have really been premised on three primary beliefs. Number one, farms matter. Farms matter to all New Yorkers. That's number one. That may not seem like a real deep thought, but it is fundamental. Number two, that farms are under threat. That our farmers face really distinct challenges and that we can't take them for granted. That just because farms have been in our communities for hundreds of years does not mean that they will be there next year or in 5 years or in 10 years. And the third is that local governments play a key role in helping to ensure a strong future for agriculture in New York and play a key role in helping to protect the land that farmers need. So those are the three kind of foundational beliefs that we have for the forums we've been hosting and are really informative for what we're hoping to present to all of you today. Just for any of you that don't know the organization that Samantha and I work for, we work for the American Farmland Trust. You may know us by our four-word bumper sticker, no farms, no food. Yep, thank you. We have a deeper mission than just that, but we're a national organization about to celebrate our 40th birthday. We have a three-part mission of promoting sound farming practices, protecting farmland, and helping to keep farmers on the land. So we like to say we work from the kitchen table to the Congress. We've had a New York State office here in New York for nearly 30 years now, and we're supported by thousands of members like all of you. This slide is a sign that I was able to photograph a few years ago. It's in the 315 area code, so we're hitting a little closer to home here. But I think it reflects a sentiment that historically has been too common in communities and the way that they approached farms and farmland. And I'll read it to you. It says, for sale, 120 acres, zoned agricultural, commercial, and residential, good farmland, great investment, city water, sewer. So that says a lot. What it really says, for the purpose of today's presentation, is that we'll allow you to farm today while we're planning for other things. And too often, farms have been treated as a temporary land use and something that was maybe a part of our past, but was not seen as an important part of our future. And as a result, situations like this have been all too common in New York. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, New York has lost the equivalent of 5,000 farms to real estate development since the early 1980s. At its worst, we were paving over 4 farms a week back in the late 80s, early 1990s. So this is an urgent problem, and local governments are particularly well suited to address these types of challenges. But at the fundamental level, if you're going to be taking action in a community, you have to be able to articulate why farms matter. This is really critical. If you're going to be asked as a local government to expend money, if you're going to be asked to enact new public policies, you need to be able to articulate to your residents, to your citizens, why it matters. And so I'm going to hit a couple of highlights, and we'll get into more discussion about these issues later in the presentation. But I want to share with you maybe 3 or 4 ideas that we think are particularly important about why farms matter and why action at a community level is so important. Number one, and this is really critical for many parts of rural New York, farms are critically connected to the health of our state's economy. According to a study that was conducted a couple years ago by Farm Credit East, New York's farms are connected. They produce now about $6 billion in farm products annually, but if there's an invisible web of business relationships that farms have with businesses that provide them with services and then with food processors. And when you add all of that up, combined, it is now about $40 billion a year in economic activity that are associated with food and agriculture in New York. About 160,000 jobs connected to that. So farms are truly a critical part of our state's economy. They're also important to where our food comes from. That most simple bumper sticker of no farms, no food, duh. That is true. Interestingly, Cornell University had done some research a few years ago looking at how many meals come from the average acre of farmland. And they looked at everything from a vegan diet to an Uber Atkins diet. And they found on average, the average acre of farmland in New York produces about 1,000 meals a year. So it's worth thinking about the health of our children, and in a world where we're supposed to grow 70% more food by 2050, this is not just a nice thing. Farms and farmland are a necessary thing, and that food security is fundamental to our national security. For those of you that are interested and care about climate change, we often haven't thought about farms as being a part of the solution to climate change. The American Farmland Trust, we released a report back in June called Greener Fields, which looked at greenhouse gas emissions coming from New York from an average acre of farmland compared to developed land. And what we found here is that the average acre of farmland in New York emits 66 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions than an acre of developed land. Now, I know for some of you, combating climate change may not seem like the top priority at a local level, but there are more communities that are thinking about climate change. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has a Climate Smart Communities program. And I think the message from us here today is farms and keeping land in farming is an important part of that climate change agenda, particularly if you're in a rural community. I'm throwing up bar charts now, so you know we're getting into the real meat of the presentation. This is the last point before I move on, but I think one of the big challenges when it came to local governments and their approach to farms and agriculture was a fundamental belief that if we have more development is going to mean more property tax base. More property tax base is going to mean more property tax revenue, and thus everybody's property taxes should go down. That has been a common sentiment in many communities, and it's not unique just to New York. It's a common philosophy. Starting back in the 1980s, starting in some communities in the Hudson Valley, we started to look at, the American Farmland Trust did a series of what we called cost of community services studies, which looked at income by land use, so primarily property taxes, by land use, so comparing houses with commercial and industry and farm and forest land, and we looked at the amount of property tax revenue, and then we compared that with the amount of services that were required by each of those land uses. And what we found on average is, not surprisingly, that residences did provide more property tax revenue, but they also required significantly more services. So on average, for every dollar that residences paid in property taxes or provide in local revenue, they required $1.19 in services. By comparison, the average acre of farmland, for every dollar that it paid in taxes, required back 36 cents in services. So these studies have been done in communities now around the country. There's been about 15, 18 of them done in New York. So this is just the kind of the average or the median of those results. But I think what it showed is that trying to develop our way out of property tax problems is often a short-sighted solution, and that in many cases, more houses, more people can bring more service demand and actually can lead to increases in property taxes. So, farms matter. That's number one. We wanted to start a conversation about some things that we're thinking about why it's so important that we have farms in our community. Now I want to move on to what local governments can do. And I think that's what many of you, it sounds like, are very deeply involved in. I'm going to touch upon a few principles and then some places where there are some tools, and then I'm going to turn the baton over to John and Jeff. Before I do that, though, I'm going to invite Samantha to come up here and to talk a little bit about a survey that we conducted earlier this fall of local governments and kind of issues that were on their mind, in minds of people like you, about what we're doing to support local farms. Samantha?
Thank you, David. So first, David said it already, we did a survey earlier this fall of folks in your position, planners, members of ag and farmland protection boards, members of town boards, planning boards, zoning boards of appeals, farmers extension agents, and found that when asked the question, do you feel your local government is showing through its actions that it supports agriculture in your community? Almost 90% of respondents said yes. So first of all, thumbs up, well done. Next, when asked, what has your local government done that's been most effective in keeping land and farming and farmers on the land? Number one was creating or expanding agricultural districts. Creating ag and farmland protection plans was number two. The third was expanding markets for farm products in your communities. And the fourth was enacting farm-friendly zoning. So these came up as both what the governments have done and what has been most effective, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then when asked, what are the most significant threats to the future of farming in your community? The most people rated highly, farmers retiring and selling land to non-farming uses. So that was number one. We have an aging farm population in this state and in this country, and all too often we see farmers without other options, selling land to non-farming uses. Second was high property taxes. 68% of folks rated this highly. And then 60% of folks rated the rising price of farmland very highly, as well as the loss of the economic viability of farms, particularly with certain kinds of farming. So then finally, we'll get to what you can do about it, but we asked people, what do you want more information on? What's going to be most useful for you to learn to keep this land and farming in your communities? And the first, number one, was we'd like to learn about building strong markets for local food. And then second was, probably unsurprisingly to many of you, we'd like to learn about the siting of commercial scale solar and how we can build out renewable energy while also keeping our best farmland in farming. And then third, communities wanted to learn more about the fiscal impacts of development versus keeping land and farming. So this is just to give you a snapshot of some of the things that we learned from this survey that we conducted earlier this fall. And this will guide our conversation as we move forward into providing you with some tools and resources.
All right. So one of the fun challenges we face in New York is that we have 930 towns, roughly, 50-some counties, 53 counties, 54 counties that have significant amounts of agriculture. There's incredible diversity in this state. And so the tools, the approaches that may work in one community can be very different in another community. What we've tried to identify are some core principles that we think that every town and every county can aspire to achieve, that no town and no county has done everything, and that no town, no county can do nothing. So these are, I just want to highlight 5 key principles that we think every local government in New York should aspire to achieve. Number 1, demonstrate an understanding of agriculture. By that I mean having something in writing that describes farms in your community, the challenges they're facing, why they matter. So for example, if you have a town comprehensive plan, crack it open. Do you have a section on agriculture specifically in your town comprehensive plan? That is a very logical place to demonstrate that you have a distinct understanding locally of agriculture, the challenges it faces, and why it matters. Secondly, creating a supportive business environment for farms. If you were to talk to farmers about the biggest business challenges they face, there would often be answers of issues that are at a bigger scale than a local government can easily address. You might hear things like immigration and workforce issues. You might hear things like milk prices. Those are really hard to address at a town scale, even at a county scale. But there are things you can do at a local level to make sure that your regulations are not inhibiting local farmers and their ability to adapt to new markets. So for example, you'll hear from farmers about farm workers. At a municipal scale, at a town scale, you can make sure that your zoning code is really intentional with making sure you're permitting different types of farm worker housing and making that really straightforward in terms of citing a farm worker housing on farms. That's not going to solve immigration issues, but it is going to help a farmer that's trying to bring workers and have them live on their property. Third, supporting appropriate property tax policy for farmland and buildings. As Samantha said, property taxes continue to be a big issue for farmers. Making sure that farmers are fully participating and agricultural landowners are fully participating in programs like agricultural assessment or farmers' school tax credit or other programs is critically important. There are other things you can do locally. So things like fire districts and other service districts, you can take steps to adopt agricultural assessment for those taxing jurisdictions. That does not happen automatically. So every local government should look at what is being done and can be done to help support appropriate property tax policies for farmland owners. Fourth, develop specific strategies to protect your best farmland. Not all land is created equal when it comes to farming. Some land is just inherently more productive, more versatile, more resilient for farm use. So as a community, you need to know where that better farmland is and then have some type of strategies, and we'll talk more in a minute about the strategies you can use, but you need to have some type of strategies about how you're going to keep that better land available for agriculture. And then lastly, as new development happens in your community, how do you take steps to make sure that development is sited in a way, designed in a way, and you have policies in place to reduce the impacts of that new development on farms and farmland? Those are 5 key principles that every local community in New York should be aspiring to achieve. So how do you do that? The good news is there's a lot of tools in a proverbial toolbox. For those of you that are getting a little nervous thinking like, oh my gosh, I think he's going to go through each of one of those. I'm not. I will just suffice it to say that as we get further in our discussion later, we'll dig into some of these individual tools. I just want to highlight that there are a lot of different ways that local governments are taking action, whether it be things like agricultural districts and right to farm laws, to local land use laws like zoning and subdivision ordinances, things like buying development rights and conservation easements, to their economic development programs. Even more recently, we're seeing more, often it's county governments looking at county dollars that are getting spent on buying food and trying to take steps to buy more of that food from farmers in New York. So there is a really broad and growing suite of tools that local governments are using. And the good news is there's some really important resources that are available to you to find those examples. I've got 2 publications that are identified here. We have a couple of copies up here. If you're interested in seeing a copy, you can find them for free on this website, farmlandinfo.org. The publication on the left, are Planning for Agriculture in New York, a toolkit for towns and counties, has case studies of 80 different communities and how they've used those different tools. Most of those communities are from New York. And if you've got enough print cartridges, I think there's 3,000 pages of codes, policy descriptions, program descriptions that you can find on that website that are in that publication on the left. The publication on the right, Growing Local, is a national publication that was just released this past spring by the American Farmland Trust and the American Planning Association, some of our partners in a project called Growing Food Connections. That is looking at these issues from a national stage. So the case studies there are from around the country of what local governments are doing to support farms, support agricultural economic development, and support local food systems. And so that new publication has a much bigger emphasis on public health and nutrition and looking at both urban environments and suburban and rural communities.